Hi there. Thank you so much to our host today. I'm really excited to be in California. I came here from Maine and am loving it here, so thank you. My presentation is based on work that I've been involved in for the last 2 decades with several colleagues. It's a project that's led by Chris Eugen at the University of Minnesota and together with Heather McLaughlin at Oklahoma State University. Workplace sexual harassment has been around for about as long, or for as long as workplaces themselves. Lynn Stewart Paramore, a research analyst at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, made this point in a 2017 NBC piece when she observed that the current Weinstein moment is really a reflection of patterns that have been ongoing for centuries in homes where women worked as servants, in factories, and eventually in Hollywood and corporate America. But sexual harassment did not really enter the public consciousness until the 1970s, when women's increasing labor force participation and the second wave feminist movement brought it to our collective attention. Today, sexual harassment is having another moment, and in a recent New York Times op-ed, Catherine McKinnon wrote that the Me Too movement is accomplishing what sexual harassment law to date has not, noting that the unprecedented speaking out that we're seeing today is finally leading us to believe targets of harassment and consequently leading to the potential for change. Our work builds from a lot of work that preceded us, about 4 decades of feminist and socio-legal scholarship that's been ongoing. The 1979 publication of Catherine McKinnon's groundbreaking Sexual Harassment of Working Women marked a turning point in the public consciousness about sexual harassment. And 7 years later, in 1986, the United States Supreme Court established sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. In our own work, we've relied on a body of research developed since McKinnon's book was published, and these include Sandy Welsh's 1999 review of harassment research in the Annual Review of Sociology. In the same issue, Christine Williams and colleagues' review of how we understand sexuality in the workplace. Work by Louise Fitzgerald and colleagues has been fundamental for how we understand how to measure harassment. And Patricia Ewick and Susan Silby's The Commonplace of Law has shaped how we think about mobilization in response to harassment. Finally, Beth Quinn's work on power and how those who are engaged in harassing behaviors understand harassment has also been vital to our own understanding of how harassment works. In this issue of the State of the Union, we consider what we know today and what we don't yet know about the prevalence of sexual harassment, its causes and costs, and how we might reduce it. Though work in this area has been ongoing for decades, we find ourselves in a new moment of public interest today in understanding how and why harassment occurs and how we can reduce it. Prevalence is difficult to assess, and this is sort of a theme, I guess, that we've heard today, because it's difficult to measure harassment. Considering only reported cases, we know that the U.S. Equal Opportunity Commission received 6,758 complaints of sexual harassment in 2016. And rates might seem relatively low given that number of complaints, but the EEOC's own task force on the study of sexual harassment reports the following. Based on testimony, our own task force on the sexual harassment reports, based on testimony to the Select Task Force and various academic articles, we learned that anywhere from 25% to 85% of women report having experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. That's quite a wide spread, and what we know is that rates appear to be much different depending on how we measure harassment in surveys. So when respondents are asked whether they've experienced harassment, rates appear to be much lower. When they're asked about specific sexually based behaviors that they've been subjected to in the workplace, rates become higher. In our own study of harassment, we use both kinds of measures. We ask respondents both a series of questions about sexually based behaviors that they've been subjected to in the workplace, and we also ask respondents whether they perceive their experiences with any of those behaviors to be sexual harassment. The data I'm going to share with you today come from the Youth Development Study, which is a prospective longitudinal cohort study run out of the University of Minnesota, began in 1988. We later interviewed a subset of the YDS survey respondents when they were in their late 20s about their harassment experiences. And our findings come from analysis of both the survey and the interview data. In our study, respondents reported experiencing relatively high rates of behaviors that could be understood as harassment in their early careers. Respondents were between the ages of 25 and 26 when they reported having had the experiences that you see reported on the screen here. As you can see in the table, men and women report similar rates of offensive joking and exposure to offensive materials at work. But more women than men report what we might think of as core markers or core indicators of harassment. Specifically, 34% of women reported staring or invasion of their personal space, and 17% of women reported experiencing touching that made them uncomfortable at work. Also, if you look at the very last columns on the table, you'll see that about 1 in 3 women in our survey said that they would define their experiences with these behaviors as sexual harassment, and about 1 in 7 men said the same. In a 2012 paper, we found that women supervisors in male-dominated work environments are significantly more likely than other women to be sexually harassed. As indicated on the table here, 58% of women supervisors working in male-dominated environments reported experiencing harassment at work. This is a scenario that runs counter to the narrative that we often hear about powerful men preying on less powerful women. And we think in these cases that men use harassment to keep women in their place. As Marie, a manager in construction, told us when we interviewed her, quote, "Just being a female in management is difficult, and guys don't like it, especially the guys that work in the field." Other forms of gender nonconformity predict harassment as well. For example, in a 2004 paper, we found that men who espouse egalitarian gender beliefs are more likely than other men to report harassment. Aside from gender, additional predictors of harassment, reports of harassment and responses to harassment include age. Adults are more likely than adolescent workers to experience the core markers of harassment, such as unwanted touching and violations of their personal space. Race, in particular, Kimberly Crenshaw and others note that stereotypes about Black women shape both the kind of harassment they experience and others' responses to their experiences. Gender expression and sexuality also play a role. Our own and others' research suggests that individuals who challenge traditional gender norms or who challenge heteronormative notions of masculinity and male power are more likely to report harassment. And of course, organizational characteristics also play a role. We know, for example, that rates are higher in male-dominated organizations and occupations, and that having supportive friends at work may serve as a protective buffer against harassment. Moving on to costs. While he was on the campaign trail in 2016, Donald Trump was asked how he hoped his daughter Ivanka might respond if she were to face sexual harassment at work. He told reporters, "I would like to think she would find another career or find another company if that was the case." What this response overlooks is that finding another career or another company comes with very real consequences for targets of harassment. While it does little to motivate employers to change the organizational cultures that encourage harassment, and it also doesn't provide the opportunity for those who harass their colleagues to understand the consequences of their behavior or to change it. Sexual harassment comes with significant costs, both to employers and employees. Employers face reduced employee job satisfaction and reduced organizational commitment, increased absenteeism and work withdrawal, and deteriorating relationships among coworkers. The EEOC reports that sexual harassment charges filed with them in 2016 cost organizations and harassers $40.7 million. But this figure is in addition to monetary damages that may have been awarded through litigation that aren't captured here. Of course, there are also costs to targets of harassment. These include mental and emotional costs, such as increased risk of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, physical costs, such as sleep problems, and economic costs. In a 2017 paper, we found that sexually harassed women reported significantly greater financial stress 2 years after the harassment had occurred when compared to those who had not experienced harassment. And in many cases, those who stand up against harassment, whether they're harassed themselves or standing up on behalf of colleagues, face ostracism at work and career stagnation. Targets experience other kinds of costs as well. This table comes from our 2017 paper on the career and economic effects of sexual harassment on working women. In it, we show that 80% of women who experienced harassment changed jobs within 2 years of being targeted. So they did take our president's advice, it seems. In fact, they're 6.5 times more likely than women who are not harassed to change jobs. Some of the women we interviewed even opted for unemployment over continued exposure to harassment at work. Lisa, a project manager at an advertising agency, told us that she quit her job to avoid ongoing harassment at work. And a quote from Lisa, she said, "I had 1 month off. I quit and I didn't have a job. I thought, that's it. I'm out of here. I'll eat rice and live in the dark if I have to." By ignoring harassment and pushing women who experience it out of the workplace, the organizational cultures that produce it remain unchallenged. Instead, we need better systems for reporting, preventing, and controlling harassment. This can happen first by hiring and promoting more women, as male-dominated environments have been found to foster higher harassment rates. And taking our cue from experts in school bullying, we should consider how bystander training might encourage a culture where employees are empowered to promote positive workplace interactions. And of course, serious and repeat offenders must face real sanctions. We've certainly come a long way since the 1991 confirmation hearing of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, at which Anita Hill testified about the ongoing harassment she endured from Thomas at the Department of Education and the EEOC. But as subsequent waves of attention to harassment have occurred in the late 1990s, centered on President Bill Clinton, and today, thanks to the Silence Breakers, recently featured on Time Magazine's Person of the Year cover, and the Me Too movement, it remains to be seen whether or to what extent these movements will ultimately be transformative. The question is whether organizations will recognize the reputational, personnel, and economic costs of harassment, and in turn embrace the wholesale cultural changes required to reduce and prevent future harassment. Thank you.